adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, Proposition's world is a world in which no one can move on. It's a world of endless investigations and court trials trying to find who committed some atrocity, who contributed in some way, punishing any individual who you felt owes you something. A public list of names of individuals who were involved in this, to name and shame them, highlighting how everyone within the community is so attached to the wrong that it is impossible to imagine a world in which these communities can move on. We stand over in places where atrocities have happened the idea that certain leaders were forces of evil that came into communities and did wrong. They brought some people along with them enthusiastically, but other individuals within it were coerced, were manipulated, or had things other than their own advancement in the system in their mind, which is what Proposition have to stand over. We think that the Proposition world leads to trialing, or we stand for policies like trialing the leaders, the orders, people who gave out orders, people who orchestrated these atrocities, and we stand over things like goodwill agreements that try and get some sort of amnesty and agreement, things like the Good Friday Agreement, in order for people to be able to move on. Proposition's policies are wide-scale persecutions. How far do you go down the chain of command? How many people do you think it is acceptable to put in jail for this atrocity if you believe that every single person who contributed in some way is responsible? The counter-narrative is here because I think opening government aren't right here. On opposition, we blame Hindu leaders for the atrocity. On Proposition, they have to blame all Hindus who facilitated the atrocity happening in any capacity. That means more people are blamed on their side. Why did you vote these people in years before they became manipulative and abusive? Why did you join the army, even though it was the only way you might have been able to go to college, even though you were scared for your life if you weren't going to? Why did you not protest in the streets, even though protesting in the streets might have resulted in you being shot? This is not the reality of these situations, and it is harmful for these communities to interpret them in this way. Why do we think our counter world, in which you don't emphasize the banality of evil, but rather focus on the leaders and the people who did the most harm, is better? Firstly, it's important for accepting people back into the community that this narrative is not emphasized, because it is impossible in a situation where more than half of the population of a community have been involved in an atrocity to just get rid of them, to put them all in jail. The reality is they will still exist within that community in some be able to see that maybe there were reasons other than their own personal motivation for furthering themselves within that system, that you can have it justified in some capacity. Why is it important that we prioritize the future cohesion of these communities over something, a vague idea of pure justice and direct accountability for everyone who did something wrong? Because a successful community is the thing that is able to provide the things and the policies to people that were denied them in the atrocity. So if you think it's bad that atrocities happened and people were denied things, the things you should prioritize in this debate is how do we best get to a community that can provide the things that were denied to those people in the future. Freedom to live, a place to be happy and to live openly with your family and the people you love. Secondly, we think you improve communities because of how you interact with prosecutions. Days in court are important for communities who've been subject to atrocities for two reasons. Firstly, it's an idea of catharsis. They share information about what happened and you have a reckoning of the crimes. But also it's because it's some sort of kind of feeling that it's the justice you are owed is being fulfilled. Communities construct their expectations of what they need in order to move on based around a community discussion and consensus on what you are owed. Proposition's world is one which gives an unachievable and impossible thing to these people. It tells them that you are owed justice from every single person who was involved in this. There is no way to move on unless Proposition can prove how you are supposed to have a trial for every individual who was involved in the army in some capacity or contributed to it in an administrative way. Because that is how people perceive what they are owed under the banality of evil. Proposition creates an unachievable and impossible expectation. The impact of that is that communities are dragged on living in this atrocity because they don't get that feeling of catharsis or feeling of what they are owed. We basically, it's just about, none of these are right? There's no way to objectively move on from an atrocity, but we are picking the idea that we think these communities should go with that is most likely to be achievable for them, so that they can feel that they can move on and that they are owed something. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
Russia allows to discount that these people, random people, were coerced, do not have agency. else.
So, because this is what I'm going to talk about now, right? Because it's about, is the concept true about the idea of banality of evil? They have to stand over no motive for their actions other than furthering their own advancement. It's just objectively untrue that that is why people engage with systems that cause atrocities. They are afraid for their own families and their own lives and sense of self-preservation. But also, some of them see it as justified, not in the grand scheme of things, but in the arc of their own life. Because even though they're oppressing some other people, there were times in their life when they were oppressed, and they need to do it to get ahead, to provide for people around them. So even if it's not proportional, it is justified to the individuals who carried out these acts. When you tell them that it was not justified and that every single person engaged with was evil, you alienate them. They are the people who you need in this process for the communities to move on. What is the impact of alienating these people? Firstly, the public at large, who you are now branding as having committed this evil and owing something back to the community and accepting they're wrong, are unlikely to engage with policies that portray them in that way because they think it's completely misrepresentative of the experience that they had, that they were coerced, that they were manipulated. So that means that you have public resistance against things like commemorating issues or prioritizing reparations to particular groups, because individuals feel like they are being targeted as great forces of evil when that's not how they view it in their own minds. Even if objectively we think that they are, we need them to cooperate with this, given that there will be a significant amount of the population. But secondly, and importantly, they don't notice the warning signs of these things happening again. If you say that the only motivation for people doing evil was that they wanted to further themselves within an evil regime, when they feel like they are doing something and they can justify it because they are being coerced or they fear for their family, you don't have that link between the past atrocities and future atrocities, because they'll see it as a separate issue. They'll say, the people who did that, they were evil and self-serving. I am prioritizing my family and trying to survive. We stand behind a more reasonable and true narrative that embraces the fact that individuals were coerced and a more realistic comparative. Please oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition and the microphone the Prime Minister.
Okay. I know Slobodan Milosevic died before we ever got to punish the person. But Milosevic still lives in the Balkans. He lives in a form of ethno-nationalism. He lives in the celebration of chants and the kinds of songs people in the countries of former Yugoslavia still sing. And because of that, because even when Milosevic is dead, the system survives. The incentive structure that drives individuals to seek their own advancement in the system still exists, and that is the problem. The POI from closing opposition is importantly uncharacteristic. Anti-Semitism lives not only in Nazi Germany, not only in Germany if it does. It lives in many countries that I'll not mention, but you're familiar with my passport, and in any other areas you also understand that it is that because people are capable of racism, and a system that perpetuates that racism is something we should target. That is why closing opposition POI is up for debate, but furthermore, opening opposition makes the wrong debate, because in our world is where you can divorce individuals from the system that forces them to act in a certain way, and we move away from just criticizing the leaders in that same system. This question will answer a few things. This speech will answer a few things. The first is, how do we best identify evil? The second is, how do we then talk about catharsis moving on? And finally, I'll have a chat about, say, current conflict and why it extends that as well. But first, just on account of opening opposition's case, I think it's important to note that Their argument is the existence of our case somehow means you have to blame every single individual. That is blatantly untrue. I think if you listen to our speech, the case here is literally labeling systems. Let's give an example. Apartheid South Africa involves the blaming of a particular system that led to structural discrimination of a group of individuals because of their color. That is not to punish those individuals, in fact it was the exact opposite. It was TRCs. It was that the recognition that the changing of those incentives is what's necessary for a state to move on. Therefore, what they must contend is why blaming the leaders specifically and obsessing over the punishment of the leaders are necessarily what you need to have in order to move on from a system. The second reason why they're wrong is because, let's just think about it for a minute, right? In their world, the system can still exist in other areas. So clearly, if this is the case, if the system and the structural incentives can exist in other areas, then the critique of the system is what divorces you from the people, not necessarily, say, our case, not necessarily their world. And finally, I think just to recognize the fact that individuals are evil in their world. In our world, it's evil is banal. People act just because they have to, and it's otherwise very important. That's why they're out of the debate. Now, importantly, I think we must first discuss how can we identify evil best. And I think Arth talks about a few things. That people are that evil exists because individuals have to protect themselves, and that evil stems from the system, and identifying that is really important. I think what they don't respond to, therefore, is that to a large extent, if you want to identify evil and prevent the revival of the systems, it's important to note that even if we prosecute everyone and remove all the leaders from previous regimes, the incentives can resurface in a myriad of ways. And that's why Haas argument is important, right? Because identifying that the system can revive, and any semblance of what was reminiscent of the previous regime, be it colonialism or apartheid, is extremely important. That is why any resemblance of things like this ethno-discrimination can be labeled as a potential revival of a system that once oppressed individuals. But that only happens when you have some sort of focus on that particular system and not the individuals themselves, but on the incentive structure that led to that. But the second reason to add on to that is that it's temporal permanence. So the idea is, focusing on the incentive structure that made individuals do like that is something that can last through time. It has temporal permanence in the way in which you can critique. When individuals die, people think those things, atrocities, die with them. But that's not true. And making people not forget of that is extremely important. And that's how you allow for the, maintenance of that form of change in post-conflict societies. No, thank you. I think then let's talk about catharsis and moving on. And here I think generally us in opening opposition generally agree on the same benefits, right? We think catharsis and moving on is generally important because, well, a lot of things bind to the system, allows for moving on, etc., and the development of a country. But specifically, I'll give you multiple reasons why forgiveness is more probable on their side. A critique of the system means you can blame the system and the structures that involve as opposed to individuals. And he talks more than that, right? The first thing is forgiveness is very difficult in these areas because you can't extricate those individuals from due to their ethnicity or race or group. But the difference is here you give one added reason, a huge reason, that everyone was part of this whole system that they were responsible for, and that you allow for some form of forgiveness. The only argument they give you is that, well, you alienate most individuals because now they can't buy into the system given that you have to blame everyone. The problem is we're not. Like, perpetrators can still be prosecuted in our world, just people on top, leaders, and the reason why those leaders can be prosecuted on top in our world is because those leaders are responsible for the system and development system. So, in our world, what you can imagine here is the punishment of people on top, like Hitler, like Milosevic. But we don't have to obsess over all the individuals who moved on, who go down from that. The new system in their world, however, requires that you get every individual to be responsible for themselves. But what's important here is that at the end of this, you allow for some sort of moving on because individuals themselves can agree that to a large extent, these individuals were not responsible, not commit any atrocities, doesn't happen. What is the comparative that Art tells you? No, thank you. The comparative is that people from the particular group, like the Shona in Zimbabwe, for example, have more of an incentive to reject any sort of accusations that they get and call it factual errors. And as a result of that, what happens is it just sparks more conflict. Less buy-in to the system from ethnic minorities in the areas of post-conflict. And it's extremely harmful because that need to reject, say, their role in the obsession exists because of that. But we are closing.
The opening government would have you believe that people who had to survive a genocide will now be able to reconcile with them telling them, oh, the evil that hurt you came from a metaphysical, abstract existence of a system. Clearly illogical on their side.
I mean, like, this is what the probability, like, given that, to a large extent, we have to move on and forgive and buy into a system that inextricably must be linked to some people in the communities, it is more likely that they forgive and buy into the system that's still dominated by the Shona like Zimbabwe in our world than theirs. That's really important. So look, why does this also extend the conflict of atrocities if it's current at the moment? I get two reasons. Number one, leaders often have cults of personalities like Modi, etc. It's very easy to obsess over the leaders and try to remove them, but very difficult to remove them because of loyalists. However, in our world, in the blaming of the system, you allow for people to rally against specific elements of the system that can remove it. So, you would far more rather that the system changes and say those particular leaders be in power, rather than the opposite, because at least you get some structural changes that benefits the minorities and people oppressed at the moment. And that's more likely, because you get more buy-in from the people who are part of the groups that are oppressing other groups. Because those individuals know that, well, to a large extent, buying to the system doesn't mean the attack on themselves, but rather an attack on the system. Opening government wants to talk about saving the lives of individuals, but more importantly, preventing that we forget, lest we repeat the harms of the past. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Well, that's good.
Never gets out.
Ashley explains to you 4 things in her speech. She explains to you, first of all, proposition create unachievable expectations of what communities are owed. Because they create an idea that when you are attacked by all people, and in a system where we understand that justice is if someone does you a wrong, you deserve that wrong to be recognized, then you create an unachievable reality in terms of how you achieve that justice. Opening governments say that justice can be achieved by structural change. We give you structural change. So insofar as that is true, we achieve that. But also, even if opening government are correct and they achieve structural change, and also they make those minorities and oppressed communities still feel like they are owed more, right? So even if structural change happens on both sides of the house, minority communities feel that they are owed more by more people in the world and that justice was not, owing was not recognized, and so they are less able to interact well with that community, more cynical of them, and in general, that in terms of the policies they push for and integration, that happens worse. Second thing Ashley explains to you, and that is related to this, is that we achieve more accepting of people back into communities. Look, if conflict happens, the way that you prevent conflict from happening again, which is what OG wants, is you create links between those communities and make sure that conflict doesn't happen again. You stop making people of opposite sides of arguments. You stop making one person an aggressor and one person a victim, and you start recognizing that you have mutual aims and that you can recognize each other's pain. That doesn't happen on their side of the house. Third thing that Ashling tells you is that we actually prevent future violence by recognizing warning signs in future. Because warning signs isn't you didn't protest on the street. Warning signs is your political leader has decided to implement a policy that means we are segregated, or that declares that our particular group is less deserving of certain rights, or that our particular group shouldn't have the same access to resources as other groups in our society. That doesn't happen on their side of the house insofar as at least some of the rhetoric of oppressed groups is around the idea that individual people not interrupting or like voting in their self-interest is a bad thing. Presumably people always continue to vote in their self-interest. They don't explain why that doesn't happen, so you can't recognize warning signs in future in the same way. The fourth thing that Ashling explains to you is that on our side of the house, the population is more willing to accept policies. I'm going to do some rebuttal, and then I'm going to talk about how we can compel action, why that's important, and how it happens best on our side of the house. First response. They say that this is not a debate where you have to call other people evil. That's the point of the wording of banality of evil. It requires you saying that someone else is evil. This is not the banality of coercion. It is the banality of evil. And that's the point of this debate, right? You have done something wrong to me, and it was evil. Like, it was motivated by you wanting to cause harm to me, or it caused harm to me, and there is no justification for it. That's how evil works. But also, in the world we live in, if you call someone else evil, or if you say they are guilty by virtue of banality of evil, everyone doesn't just go, oh, they probably just mean we're fine and we can be friends in future. Like, that is not the assumption of people in terms of the sort of narrative or rhetoric that happens on their side of the house. But also, the world that we live in is that if you do something evil, you are deserving of punishment. So that is the sort of conversation that happens at that time. If it doesn't, then you waste valuable post-conflict resolution time focusing on people who do deserve to be punished, because there just are more evil people in the scale of who did
evil to oppressed groups when atrocities have happened. And either you water down that idea of what it is to be an evil person and therefore make it less possible to punish those people, or you just waste general times in terms of conversation and explaining why those people just mean it was particularly wrong. It is important that we lock up people who have killed groups of people or made their lives significantly worse, because that is what stops people from doing it again. And if it doesn't happen on their side of the house, then they don't get to stop that from happening on their side of the house. Second response, there is no compelled on their side of the house, right? This debate is exclusively about doing something for your own advancement, not self-preservation, not because somebody made you do it. Like, that's the point of the argument, right? So even if you could have done something for your own advancement and it had connotations that were that you were trying to help yourself, the concept of focusing on you did it for your advancement does not say that if you had not done it, you would actively have been harmed, right? So if you say you were evil because you did this action or failed to act in this way for your own advancement, you do not recognize that they had so much more to lose, possibly, had they not done that thing for their own advancement. So you don't get the analysis of coercion or compelled on their side of the house, because the groups that are starting these conversations at the only time that they are able to talk, because note that it is usually explicitly post-conflict when, say, like international bodies get involved or there's a particular push to resolve conflict, that these groups actually have a proper voice on a stage, insofar as they use that voice to say, no, you are motivated by your own advancement, and don't rely or don't express any sort of recognition of coercion or anything else. You don't create a narrative that is centered around there were no other alternatives, which could be the case. That means that the OG case is not in the debate, because it relies on the analysis that they give you about compulsion, and that is not in the debate, because structural critiques only happens when you focus on compulsion exclusively, and compulsion exclusively is not the narrative these groups spread. The third thing about blaming the system, right, first of all, OG say you can focus on how voting systems pit people against each other and that's bad. They don't give you a mechanism for how they change voting systems. They don't give you a mechanism for how people will vote differently. Presumably people will always vote in their own self-interests on any side of the house, because that's what we do in democratic systems, where we have a limited amount of time to express a particularly strong preference, and we think about things like our families and our future, and we don't think about minority communities who we might not have any particular affiliation to or even live close to. And that means that they don't get the reform that they talk about. But furthermore, when you don't talk about the people who are compelled, it's not about the system, because it's the system that compelled them. It's not the individual actions that each individual took that created the problem. It's that a system gave them the instructions, and that is how you focus on a conversation that's about the system. When you talk about people like Milosevic, who made people feel feelings like being afraid or being proud or whatever it is, and that is a criticism of that system in particular, because that is what motivated people's actions. They would not necessarily have taken those actions on their own. Yeah, closing though.
So comparing this debate is either the banal evil or evil, which means that I, as a victim, when I think of them, I'm more likely to accept that they did because they had to make a living.
Okay. So Aisling explains to you that this is about proportionality. Doing something because you want to protect your family or yourself does not necessarily mean that you are evil, and insofar as you call someone evil for doing that, you do not recognize that they had other incentives at that moment in time. Let's talk about how you compel action. Let's talk about guilt. Who needs to have guilt? Leaders, politicians, people who are trying to resolve conflict, post-conflict governments. They're the people who can do things like create redistribution policies, a curriculum and history building, tear down statues, whatever it is you need to create change. This is important change, because this is the change that led to those banal evil things happening in the first place, because people followed the leaders to commit those atrocities. And so if you tear down the statues that allowed them to do that, then you tear down the systems that allowed them to do that in the future. But this is good because it makes press groups more powerful, and also it's a signal effect for the rest of the population. You create guilt when you don't come from a place of it was wrong of you for not to intercept with the soldiers who had guns, but rather it was wrong for the soldiers to shoot us with their guns. That creates sympathy. That creates public understanding of the issue that happened, the problem that happened, and gets the public on side. That's how you compel people to come on side with you, when they recognize absolutely how abhorrent the things that happened to you were. Please oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Job and Second for the debate, Member to Cop and Member of Government.
went to this debate looking forward to having a good discussion about Hannah Arendt. But I can't because nobody seems to have read the book. However, I know Pushnik and Hafner have, so look forward to this becoming an interesting closing half debate, finally. Before I move on to the extension, first of all, why the world is better for future generations, both the victims and for people from the country or ethnicity that has committed atrocities. And secondly, why we get more efficient long-term reconciliation, let us clear up the frame mess we get from opening opposition. Note that banality of evil is not a narrative of blame. The preservation of self-interest, if you had read the book, is not the idea of me wanting to rise to the echelons of the Nazi party. It's me having a calculus. Either I am a clerk in Auschwitz, or my family is killed. My friends are killed. I am killed. It is the idea of self-preservation of life that we can all understand. Note, on both sides there is no justification for what you did, but the comparative is the motive. On their side, everyone is complicit because it's in their blood. Even if they did not fire a gun, they wanted to fire a gun, and they would have fired that gun if they had had the chance. Leaders get guilt on both sides of the house. On our side, maybe even more, because they were the top of the hierarchy of radical evil that forced other people to preserve their lives. Opening government, you should have said that in your speeches. The comparative here is, on our side, you get a clear legal argument, which we usually use to exculpate people, right? The lack of agency and ability to act on your side. Their side is where we pull out 90-year-old soldiers, hunt them down in Argentina, have publicized trials which draw the anger of right-wing parties, even 70 years after a conflict has happened, because the evil still exists. We must hunt it down to the ends of the earth. It's unlikely we get the reconciliation and reparations on their side. The Good Friday Agreement they mentioned, they should know that because they're Irish, has the prospect of future unification, proportional representation, that can only exist if you believe that in the future the same conflict will not be repeated because of an inherent trait of a nation. It is unclear what O stands for in this debate. Why is the world better for future generations from both sides of the conflict? Note that this policy, cross-temporally and in the long term, spills over onto people from a nation have committed atrocities, and they never had the agency to choose that. We say it's a gross removal of agency. And that's why CEO's point that anti-Semitism is horrible, because they stand for a historical determinism of identity before you were born. Even if anti-Semitism existed in Germany for 1,000 years, they would have this determine the identity of every future German born, although the culpability does not exist. Why is this horrible? One, because you're expected to behave in a certain way by the virtue of being born in a certain place. This means you do not have the agency to choose your self-representation, to choose the way in which the world sees you, which means there's necessarily a discrepancy between the way you act and you want to achieve your happiness and the way other people allow you to, your employers, your friends, and the people who surround you. This means that you necessarily do not have recourse to choose the way in which other people see you as presented, although you may want to do so. Secondly, your behavior is always scrutinized and you can never pass the test because of confirmation bias. Everything you say, everything you like on Facebook, every action is scrutinized for proof that you are another evil individual from this group, that you may commit the same things your people has committed in the past. We say whatever you do, this scrutiny cannot be removed. But thirdly, you're expected to moderate your behavior, right? Because at the point where I know that if I am a Serb and I go to holiday in Croatia, I may be beat up. I'm led to a life of fear when walking down the street, of fear that somebody will spit in my face, of fear that somebody is going to punch me, and finally a feeling of helplessness, because you cannot counteract this. These are narratives in the media, in history textbooks, in songs, in literature. Whatever I do, I cannot change it for myself. I would also contend that these people are more likely to be revanchists, right? These people are also probably more likely to vote right-wing and do not want to pay reparations. But we finally say it's principally illegitimate because they visit the same harms upon a certain group of people as the harms that were visited on the original victims in the first place. They perpetuate the same thing. And to the extent to which there was no culpability, we do not see why this culpability should be extended to future generations. Of course, they may stand up here and say, sure, but the comparative are the victims and they are more important. Even if we agree, what CEO says in their POI is uncomparative, right? The most proximate victims of a genocide probably are traumatized anyway. If a mother has lost 4 sons, there is no narrative that brings back her sons. What matters is the future generations. What they bring them is fear. You do not solve trauma because evil is always on the border. So as long as we have a border on the river Drina, the Serbs can cross it again. This means that you do not suffer the trauma because future generations are taught that the conflict may be repeated, that tanks may come again, that the villages will be destroyed, that they will hear and see the same stories that their parents have told them have happened because of the evil that exists on the other side. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because at that point, you as a nation are likely to vote in parties and vote in actions that are aggressive towards that group in terms of trade, in terms of policy, and in terms of diplomacy. And at that point, these conflicts are more likely to happen and just entrench the perception in the long term. But secondly, this fear cannot be dissuaded in rational terms because you always see the evil as present. I'm very happy for you that you don't have to read comments on news pages in Croatia because these people believe that the Serbian communist conspiracy is very much alive. They are in our government structures. They're controlling us from within. They're financing protests. They're financing parties. We can never get rid of them. The politicians in the parliament you disagree with are necessarily Serbs, and they serve the Serb conspiracy. What is the problem with this? Because at that point you can never get rid of that narrative. Yeah, Pushnik, yeah, I know you have.
But this is exactly the problem, right? Because the Serbian communist conspiracy is exactly blaming some sort of a metaphysical abstract system behind. They never divorce the system from the attribute of Serbness on their side of the house.
But that is untrue. Because on our side of the house, we blame the individuals who have started the system. We blame Milosevic. We blame him for forcing the Serbs to be recruited into the army. We say on our side of the narrative that the response to the recruitment in Belgrade was 20% because people did not want to go to that war. We see you're less likely to want eternal vigil on our side, you know? Finally, why do we get more efficient long-term reconciliation? Note that the international community always accepts the narratives of the victims, right? In trials, in commemorations. If the narrative of the victims is a narrative of perpetual evil, that is going to be the narrative the international community accepts. At that point, as the people of a nation has committed atrocities, you are unlikely to have effective collective guilt. You're unlikely to have positive efforts to change this, like Germany had with creating the European Union, with apologizing for the Holocaust, so on and so forth. Because if you love everything, you have no agency. This is Germany after World War I. Germany is guilty. We have to tear it apart because it's always a danger in the center of Europe. It is always going to be. That led to the World War II that we talk about because they felt they had no other agency, no other recourse than to take up guns against those who blame them as a man from the Balkans who has seen this. Never been more proud to propose.
I thank the member of government and I have to call upon the member of opposition.
I too would like to talk about the system. On the government, they believe that this abstract notion of the system is just put to the nations by some, I don't know, divine god or some kind of individual. On closing opposition, we tell you that the system is inexplicably linked to the culture, to the nation. The Serbian state of Milosevic didn't just happen because of Milosevic, it happened because of 1,000 years of Serbian wet dreams about Great Serbia and the tradition of warfare of the Serbian nation. So even if the state was authoritarian, even if the response to go to war was 20%, still the support for the regime was there in the nation, and that's how it happened. The Nazi Germany was built not because Hitler came to power from somewhere, it was built on a tradition of anti-Semitism. But what I'm telling you now is not really that important, because what matters in the debate is the perception. So even if, at the best, Milosevic is to blame for everything, or Hitler is to blame for everything, it is important how the other nations, in this case the victims, perceive the nation. And here, like, we think that the Croatians inexplicably link Milosevic to the Serbians, and yeah. So what we are saying to you here on CG is that when you blame the system, you blame the Germanness, you blame the Serbness of the entire conflict, right? So what is then the comparative in the debate? The comparative is that in their world, this system is somehow just given, right? It just happens, and it happened in a vacuum, right? But in our world, the system is sustained by moral decisions and moral actions of the individuals, right? And this is very important what I'm telling you. Why? Because in our world, you're then less likely to blame every one of the other nation for the actions that have happened, like for example, women or the people who didn't do that, because you're not inexplicably linking them to the system, you're having more moral actions. And more importantly, we also believe that this debate is about the long term too, right? Because we feel that especially OG and to a partial degree also OO focus on how today we are going to forgive the individuals who have perpetuated those crimes. And we believe that to a large degree this is kind of irrelevant in this debate because as a victim of a genocide or someone who has lost people in the genocide, you're highly unlikely to forgive someone of the national group that has perpetuated this crime of a certain crime. But what is very important is for the future generations, right? And we would like to go one step further than what OO is saying about seeking legal action and stuff like that, so that we can end this, because we believe they never prove to you how the narrative really impacts how those individuals are punished, right? The debate is about narrative. But what matters in debate is how we judge the actions of future generations, right? And when you say that decision, to cooperate in a system that does something bad is a moral choice. And here again, we really appreciate how CG is telling you, yeah, you don't really have a free decision, the state forces you. It doesn't matter, right? It's a point of perception, that if it is perceived as a moral choice, something that you can opt out, and it doesn't really matter if you can, we do believe that you can, you can still die, you can still have them in some other ways, you can still refuse the position, but then how you judge future generations, like how now Croatians look to the young Serbians, they don't see them just as part of the Serbian culture that is perpetuated, but again they see them as individuals who yet again have the choice to take a moral decision, right? Either they are going to do something bad to them or they won't do something bad to them. And this is how on CO we win this debate, because we talk strictly about the narrative, how it impacts them, and on the long-term choice, right? But we believe that this debate is also important because the narrative that victims push greatly impacts the narrative that is then present with the perpetrators. Before I move to that,
It is very visible to see the system change, like apartheid being removed. But if you don't blame the system, you have to blame the system directly. How can you perceptually identify and know that white South Africans have changed? You can definitely see that South African government has changed.
The change in the government, specifically for example South Africa, the change in government doesn't mean that the white Afrikaners have changed, or that the perception that the white Afrikaners have changed. It just means that now, and this is the perception of the people, not in fact, that now the blacks are in power or whatever, right? So it's not really visible always to see how this system has changed, and so I don't really see what's the problem. So what I'm getting to now is how the narrative that the victim push greatly impacts the narrative that is then present with the perpetrators. Why? Because we believe that to a large degree also because of the vast moral power they have, and also because this is the greatest legitimization, right? If the victim is saying that what you have done is something that system is to blame, so that you should just blame the system, then we also believe that you as a perpetrating nation are very likely to believe that. And why is this so harmful? Right? So now here the debate shifts to how the Germans, how the Serbians, and how the other nations that perpetuated crimes are feeling. We say that at this point, you're then saying that the crimes that we have done as a nation are something that can be individualized, that we can blame an individual, right? And that's why you have the books coming out in Germany like High Hitler, meaning High Hitler as in he was on drugs, he was doing something crazy, right? So the link in this that is produced in the mindset in these peoples is that we are not to blame for the conflict that we have caused, because anyway the system has caused it, and the system itself is just something that happened because of some irrational happenings, right? And the harm here is that you never get to the process of denazification or cleansing yourself, or thinking about the past actions you have committed. So on CG, what we have done is that not only that we've told you how the narrative itself is important when it comes to judging moral actions, and we are the ones who have really established a clear comparative in debate, we're also the one focusing on the long term, telling you how, for the today's situation, for the most of the cases, it is a wash. But it's very important how we judge future generations, whether we give them a chance to have like a moral choice in what they're going to do them, or are we just going to perceive them as an inexplicable part of the system thereof. Because of those reasons, shall propose.
I thank the member of opposition and to go up on the government question.
Look, well, this is least comparative about the direct victims of genocide or atrocities, right? Because these people, no matter what narrative we push, they're always going to feel this void and they're always going to feel hurt and they're unlikely to accept what everyone tells them because none of you know how we feel and stuff like this. So they're least likely to change. But we're going to engage with this and why they change on our side of the house. So who this debate is about? It's about future generations who did not have the proximate experiences of conflict, and we then have a choice. It's either give them fear and dread, or give them peace and explain that there's no perpetual evil. That's why we are going to win this debate. A couple of points of response to call the opposition, and then moving on with our case. So first say that we link Milosevic and Serbs together. That's not because we don't have banality of evil, right? If we have banality of evil, then you divide Milosevic and his guilt and the guilt of regular people, the average Serb I meet on this coast and stuff like this. But secondly, they said like, oh, but it should be the moral action of a system and the choice. If they believe it's moral to kill me, and they killed me because they believe this is the right thing to do, and not because they were coerced to do this and forced by their own existence and like having to like not to be killed by the system or having to like eat, that means there's more hatred from my perspective. Because they chose to do this, they believe it was moral, they are always going to think like this, and they're always going to hurt me and stuff like this. This is why we think there's a clear comparative here. Because you, from the perspective of the victims of the country that was hurt, there's two dangers here. On our side of the house, you have the danger of systematic capture on the other side. On their side of the house, you have the inherent danger that's looming over you, which means that you're necessarily always going to radicalize more in order to defend yourself against this danger and stuff like that. Lastly, they say that we are not to blame for this conflict, and that's how, like, they say that, oh, Germans are not going to accept, blah, blah, blah. We say that there's always this narrative, we are not to blame to some extent, like in people and stuff like this, but that it's comparative here. Because if you tell them that it's all of their blame, and you always tell them, like, all of you are evil and stuff like this, the future generations are comparative here. Because they internalize this hate, they believe it's unjustified to them, and they cannot simply like move on and stuff like this. This is what we talked about in our second extension about Germany and stuff like this, and they didn't respond to this well. Let's talk about the learning communist trend. On our side of the house, when the system is gone, and you believe that the banality of evil, like the evil comes from the system itself, then the incentives for people to be evil are gone. On their side of the house, if people are inherently evil, then this looming threat continues. This is what happened in like countries of Eastern Europe and stuff like this, with the idea of communists being around us. Because even when the system was gone, because people were portrayed as inherently evil and not banally evil, the threat is still around us. That's when paranoia happens and stuff like this. But that also means that in order to fight against systematic capture by the other state, it's always a lesser burden than inherent evil. Which means that on their side of the house, countries are likely to escalate more because there's always the perception of we must do everything that's in our power to do this. That means that oftentimes policies which on their side of the house people are going to internalize and think are good, such as not trading with them, such as not having diplomatic relations with them, as blah blah blah, because they are inherently evil, are going to suck because they are going to make them more systematically dependent and more being able to capture on our side of the house, which prolongs conflict and stuff like this. Why is opening opposition not comparative really confusing this debate? Because there existed a system which had ideological political leadership which was inherently evil on our side of the house, right? But the majority of the people in this system were banally evil and stuff like this. We would interpret the system as coercing subordinates into being evil. Therefore, there's no clear inherent evil on the subordinates, but incentivized evil. But this is a comparative. There were people who were evil on our side of the house as well, but they are on the top of this system because their evilness is like twice as much. These are the people who coerced the subordinates, but also created the ideological and political evil because they actually believed on them. That means that we put the blame on them for creating evil. We tried them. Counterfactual is everyone is evil per se. So expectations which they claim on their side of the house is that we try them all, even if they're 90, 70, like dying, because they were inherently evil. So you don't have the mitigating effect of them being incentivizingly evil, if that's even the word. That's not what it is. The guilt is necessarily higher on their side of the house because they wanted to be guilty and they were not forced to be guilty. So all the stuff they talk about actually goes on our side of the house. That's not what it is. Let's talk about commemorations. If the opposite side was less evil, because like the majority was banally evil, there's a smaller threshold you can justify it on your own side about committing crimes. If the other side was inherently evil, then my guys who did a lot of crimes also can be inherently evil because that's the necessary response they need to get. This means you get more sympathy for victims on the other side and more commemorations because it's a lesser burden to justify on your side of the house than comparatively on their side of the house.
Engagement?
But plus, I will take it. Your people might not be judged as evil, but banally evil too right now, which means you get commemorations. Maybe the perception of your own people being guilty is different, but if they want to talk about commemorating the other side, that necessarily happens more in our side of the house and stuff like this. Let's talk about links between communities. I already engaged with this when I talked about economics, diplomacy and stuff like this. But other people's guilt is that not that they are Serbs or Croat, but they were captured by a regime. There's also guilt there because they allowed themselves to be captured by the regime. But that level of guilt is not inherent, but it is like temporary in time and stuff like this. That means that there's less instant hatred and otherizing because they're not guilt throughout their whole history, but they're guilt in different segments of history when they allow themselves to be captured by the very same regime and stuff like this. When they talk about like watering down, yeah, that's why 70% of your case is wrong and not comparative because that means that we're going to try them less on our side of the house. If you like run, but you're going to try all of them, and then you say, but you're going to water down the guilt and stuff like this. This is why there's tensions there. I will take it up.
We weren't invited to your lad's book club. We read the info slide. When community leaders say people had no motive for their actions other than promoting their own advancement, it's unclear why they interpret that as, oh, they were coerced. It was really just the system and their leaders all along, I guess.
Look, but if you don't have this narrative, the default motive is not like, ooh, but they like were rational. The default motive is they did this because of pure hate. Right? So pure hate, even if what you're saying is true, and this is literally not Hannah Arendt argument, right? Hannah Arendt argument is you were coerced to some extent. You weren't like the most like how do you say like ambitious Nazi in the system, and you wanted to be the new Hitler and stuff like this. But even if what they're saying is true, the comparative is that the default motive, if the narrative doesn't exist, is hate because people don't understand why they lost their sons, brothers, mothers, and fathers in the war. So for me to be hurt in such a great way, they all must be evil to the way I cannot comprehend them. And how can I comprehend this? It's only if I put myself in a position of being so evil as to kill theirs as well, right? We think that to the extent, which this is not comparative, like largely, because these people are so hurt emotionally, stuff like this, it's better to have a rational narrative of why my son was killed in the war than to have the irrational narrative of he was killed because there's indefinite hate and stuff like this. This is the example of missing people and like the missing people in this debate and how they like feel the most when mothers cannot find their sons and stuff like this. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I thank the government whip and have to call upon the opposition whip.
The problem I have with closing government is that closing government seems to run away from the burden in these debates. Because they go to tremendous distance to try and explain to us how under our side of the house forgiveness never happens, while they never ever prove to you why any such thing happens on their side of the house. And because they do not fulfill this burden, it's rather odd that they come to our side and accuse us of not fulfilling ours. And the point of my speech is going to be to explain to you how in the delta of this debate, closing opposition does more to prove any possible reconciliation or at least decrease antagonism on our side of the house. We agree with closing government that the framing in the closing benches is probably more correct than the one we had earlier. What is then the comparative that this debate would have? There are two comparatives, two framing of what a comparative is, one from government, one from all. The government is saying, well, you can either blame the system or you can blame the ethnicity. Whereas on closing opposition, we tell you, you either blame the system / ethnicity or you blame the individual. How do we resolve now this clash of framing? Let us walk through it quite slowly, right? When some atrocity happens, when some evil happens, that evil is perpetuated by some institution which is composed of some individuals who are a part of that institution. The crux of this debate is whether we blame the individual's moral choice for participating in that institution, or do we rather blame the institution itself because it coerces the individual either way. And specifically, let us now do the comparative in terms of antagonism or how different perceptions shape that. But first, note, in most of conflicts that you have nowadays that we're discussing, such antagonism will always persist because it is deeply rooted within culture. The fact that Croatians and Serbians do not like each other has a lot to do with the fact that the Balkans never had more than 10 years of peace since the 1453 until Tito took over in Yugoslavia. So it's a certain amount of antagonism will happen either way. So they cannot claim, oh, there's antagonism on your side, therefore you lose this debate, because they're never nuanced enough to engage with examples in a proper way. But now let's do the comparative on the analysis and show you how closing government is not taking it above closing opposition in this example. When you have what Rock explains to you in the extension, the moral choice of an individual, and we don't give a crap whether or not we are like fair to put on this like on an individual, like to put this burden on the individual. What happens is that the perception is that that individual fucked up, because that individual had the agency to do something else, even if the burden was too high, even if he should like literally commit seppuku or something like that. We tell you that he had the agency to do that. That is the perception. This is then crucial because this allows for differentiation. Look, no one will ever forgive the Nazi killers. Like, I'm not sure anyone like is gonna be able to forgive them. And the one thing Germany needs in order to be forgiven, in order to minimize the antagonism, is to have the chance to differentiate itself from the perpetrators of those crimes. And the best way to differentiate yourself from them is to say they collectively, like every individual who did that, had a moral choice, a moral agency. We are not like them. We are different from them. This was not done by us. Why is this comparatively better than what they bring to us on closing government? On closing government, they say, well, even today you have the communist Serbian propaganda in Croatia. And this is where Sprem makes a fatal mistake for their side. Why? We tell you that, first of all, every historical existence of a system of an ethnicity will intrinsically be linked to that ethnicity. Right. All the previous existences of Croatia, for instance, will be linked to identity of being Croatian, like intrinsically and inexplicably. Already, this is how it's harder for a so-closing government to differentiate themselves from the previous existences of their state if they do not blame the individuals who are in their state. For instance, every German will always have to bear connection to the Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany is a part of German identity through like historical reference, so on and so forth. And this is how, if only the system of Nazi Germany is blamed, it is much harder for the German to differentiate themselves from that regime. But what we and this is why especially the communist Serbian propaganda thing is so important, right? Because if ideologically a part of Croatia understands that Serbians, the Serbians at some point are associated with this evil regime of communist Serbian propaganda or whatever. The thing is that if the one who is to blame for the Balkan War is the Serbian communist propaganda, there is no way for the paranoiac Croat to differentiate between the Serbs who are or are not part of this propaganda, whereas on our side, with the perception of no, look, it was individual assholes who were to blame, we give them more of a chance. But furthermore, okay, actually no, before I continue, I will take opening.
Is it easier to tell people that my grandfather wasn't involved in Nazi Germany? Or is it easier to say that I am not part of Nazi Germany anymore?
Yeah, it's easier to say that I'm not part of Nazi Germany anymore because I was born after the fact. I had no moral agency to do that. Then it is to say that I, as a German, am a bearer of the collective guilt, yada yada. Okay. The second thing that happens why the bailing of the system is bad, I ask countless POIs telling you about the invisibility of the systemical evil. If you know that some individual guards came down shooting on you, etc., it's much easier for you to blame the individual and say this individual specifically is guilty of evil that was done onto me. Because you do not see the system, you do not understand the system. And then if they tell you, oh no, it was actually the system forcing you, once again, this is the situation in which you link the system to something German, right? You say, so there was something behind, something German about it that propelled and forced this individual guard to come after me, to shoot me down. This is why on the comparative, we take this delta. It's easier to differentiate from the guilt on our side of the house. But finally, and Sprem does very little work tackling the argument, we tell you that it's much easier to make Nazism seem like a banal fuck-up of the right wing when you have banality of evil. Because you can just say, oh, no one was to blame but Hitler, but even Hitler, he was a bit mad and on drugs, which is why we can still legitimately hold far-right views, because, it was all just a big fuck-up, no one is really to blame. We are opposed to that, not enough work done by government whip. This is why closing opposition is taking this debate. Thank you very much.
I think we have to whip and also fix the debate. Let's give them another round of applause.